I never thought the day I buried my husband would also be the day I'd lose everything I thought was mine. Thomas Rivera died on a Tuesday morning in September. Massive heart attack. No warning. One moment he was alive in his study, reviewing contracts for his shipping company, and the next, he was gone. I was in the kitchen making his coffee, French roast the way he liked it, when I heard the thud. By the time I reached him, his eyes were already distant, staring past me toward the cathedral ceiling he'd spent 2 years designing for our bayfront mansion in Corpus Christi. We were supposed to have decades. He was 53, I was 42. We'd been married for 7 years. The funeral was a spectacle. 300 guests, white roses everywhere, a mariachi band he'd requested years ago, and his daughter Elena, 29, beautiful, cold as ice, standing beside me in the front pew like we were strangers instead of family. We'd never been close. From the moment Thomas introduced us, she'd made it clear I was an interloper, a replacement for her mother Isabel, who died of cancer when Elena was 12. I'd tried for 7 years to build a relationship with her. She'd spent 7 years making sure I knew I'd never measure up. 3 days after the funeral, Thomas's attorney called us both to his office. The will reading. I assumed it would be straightforward. We'd split the estate, figure out arrangements for the mansion, move forward as a family. I was naive. Marshall Hewitt opened the will with the careful neutrality lawyers perfect over decades. To Elena, the 4-bedroom bayfront mansion, the shipping company shares worth millions, the investment accounts, the Mercedes, the boat, everything that mattered. To me, his wife of 7 years, a fisherman's cabin on Dock 19 in the forgotten industrial stretch of Corpus Christi Bay, a rotting structure that smelled like dead fish and diesel fuel. Elena didn't even try to hide her smile. "Well," she said, standing immediately and smoothing her designer skirt. "I guess that settles it. You'll want to start packing, Claire. I'm meeting with a realtor next week about listing the mansion." "Elena," Marshall said carefully, "your stepmother has 60 days. She won't need 60 days. Elena turned to me then, and I saw something in her face I'd never seen before. Not just indifference, but contempt. Pure, undisguised contempt. "Go live among the seagulls and leave me alone. That cabin's probably more your speed anyway." I drove to the cabin that same afternoon, my hands shaking on the wheel. The GPS took me through neighborhoods I'd never seen, past chain-link fences and graffitied warehouses, until the road turned to gravel and ended at a series of weathered docks jutting into brown water. The cabin was worse than I'd imagined. Gray, warped wood, clouded windows, a door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. The whole structure leaned slightly to the left, like the next strong wind might push it into the bay. Inside was a single room, maybe 400 square feet, with a hot plate, a rust-stained sink, and a bathroom so small I could touch both walls while sitting on the toilet. Everything smelled like brine and mildew and something older, something that made my stomach turn. I sank onto the floor and let myself break. 7 years of marriage. And this was what I got. A cabin that looked like it should be condemned. $47,000 in a bank account, while Elena got millions. That's when I noticed the floorboards near the bed frame didn't quite match the others. They were slightly newer, less warped. When I pressed my hand against them, they gave a little. Loose. I pried them up with my keys, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't name. Beneath them was a metal lockbox. Inside, a letter in Thomas's handwriting, a stack of photographs, a deed, and a small leather journal. The letter began, "My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I can only hope you'll forgive me for what I'm about to tell you. Everything I did to protect you. Everything. What I discovered in that cabin, in those photographs, in that journal, in the truth Thomas had buried beneath rotting wood, shattered everything I thought I knew about my husband, about Elena, about the mansion I'd called home, and about why Thomas had really married me in the first place. The cabin wasn't a punishment. It wasn't an afterthought. It was a test, a message, and a fortune worth more than the mansion Elena had inherited. Thomas had been dying the entire time I knew him. He'd hidden his diagnosis. He'd spent his last months negotiating a deal that would make me a millionaire. If I was smart enough to find it, brave enough to claim it, and strong enough to face the devastating truth about the man I'd loved. Elena told me to go live among the seagulls. What she didn't know was that her father had just made me richer than she'd ever be, and when she found out, everything between us would change forever. I woke up on the morning of Thomas's funeral to the sound of seagulls screaming outside our bedroom window, the bedroom that would soon no longer be mine. The gulls always gathered on the mansion's terrace at dawn, fighting over scraps from the previous night's dinner, and Thomas used to joke that they were better guests than half the people we invited to our parties. He'd stand there in his bathrobe with his coffee, watching them with something like affection, and I'd wrap my arms around him from behind and breathe in the salt air mixed with his cologne. That morning, I stood at the same window alone, and the gulls sounded like accusations. The mansion, our home for the past 7 years, stretched out behind me in elegant silence. 4 bedrooms, each larger than the apartment I'd lived in when Thomas and I met. Marble floors imported from Italy, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Corpus Christi Bay. A chef's kitchen I'd learned to cook in, following YouTube tutorials because I'd never had anything fancier than a hot plate before Thomas. The morning light caught the crystal chandelier in the foyer, throwing rainbows across walls the color of champagne. I'd picked that paint color. Thomas had let me choose everything after we married: furniture, artwork, the garden design. He'd said the house needed a woman's touch, that it had been too cold since Isabel died. I'd spent months making it warm, making it ours. And now, in 3 days, I'd learned that none of it had ever really been mine at all. But I didn't know that yet. That morning, I was still Thomas Rivera's widow, still the woman whose husband had built a shipping empire from a single fishing boat his grandfather had brought from Veracruz. Still the woman who'd met him at a literacy nonprofit, where I'd been teaching ESL classes to dock workers, and he'd shown up to make a donation and stayed for 3 hours, asking me about my students' dreams. I chose a simple black dress for the funeral, not the Chanel Elena would wear, just something respectful from Macy's. I'd never gotten comfortable with the kind of money Thomas had. He'd grown up poor in Corpus Christi's North Side, put himself through Texas A&M on scholarships and stubbornness, and built Rivera Shipping into a company that employed 300 people. But he never forgot what it was like to eat beans and rice for dinner 4 nights a week, to wear shoes until they fell apart. That's what I loved about him. He wore expensive suits to board meetings, but still ate breakfast tacos from the same truck on Leopard Street that he'd gone to since he was 15. The funeral was supposed to start at 10. Elena arrived at the mansion at 8:30, let herself in with her key, and walked past me without a word. She'd flown in from Austin the night Thomas died, checked into the Omni Hotel downtown instead of staying in her old bedroom, and had barely spoken to me except to coordinate details through Marshall Hewitt's office. She was wearing her grief like armor: black dress, black heels, black sunglasses she didn't take off even inside, her mother's pearl necklace at her throat. "The cars will be here at 9:15, she said, checking her phone. "I've arranged for the family to ride together. You can follow in your own car if you'd prefer." The family, as if I wasn't part of it. "I'll ride with you," I said quietly, because Thomas would have wanted us united, at least today. She finally looked at me then, over the rim of her sunglasses, and something flickered in her expression. Not quite cruelty, but close. "Suit yourself." St. Patrick's Cathedral was packed. I recognized faces from Thomas's business: Port Authority officials, shipping company executives, the mayor. Old friends from his college days, workers from the docks, men with weathered hands and sun-damaged skin who'd shown up in their best shirts to pay respects to a man who'd never forgotten where he came from. And society people, too. The country club set who'd embraced Thomas once his bank account reached a certain threshold. Women in designer black who air-kissed each other and spoke in hushed, performative tones about what a tragedy it all was. I sat in the front pew between Elena and Thomas's sister, Rosa, who'd flown in from San Antonio and kept squeezing my hand. The priest, Father Miguel, who'd married Thomas and me, spoke about God's mysterious timing, about how Thomas had touched so many lives, about faith in the face of loss. I stared at the closed casket and tried to remember the last thing Thomas had said to me. It had been Monday night. We'd eaten dinner on the terrace, grilled red snapper that I'd overcooked slightly, but Thomas had eaten every bite and complimented it anyway. We'd shared a bottle of Pinot Grigio and watched the sun set over the bay, painting the water the color of rust and gold. He'd been quiet, which wasn't unusual. Thomas had always been a man of few words. But there was something in his silence that felt heavier than normal. "You okay?" I'd asked, reaching across the table for his hand. He'd smiled at me, that slow, warm smile that had made me fall in love with him in the first place. "Yeah, sweetheart. Just thinking." "About what?" He'd looked out at the water for a long time before answering. "About how lucky I've been. About how some things matter more than we realize until it's too late." I'd laughed and told him he was getting philosophical in his old age. He'd squeezed my hand and said, "I love you, Claire. I need you to remember that. No matter what happens, no matter what anyone tells you, I love you." At the time, I'd thought he was just being sentimental, maybe feeling his mortality after turning 53. Now, standing in that cathedral with his body 10 feet away, those words felt like a warning I'd been too naive to hear. The mariachi band played Las Golondrinas as we filed out. Thomas had requested it specifically in the funeral plans he'd made years ago, before he'd even met me. Elena walked ahead of me down the aisle, accepting condolences with practiced grace, and I followed in her wake, feeling like a ghost at my own husband's funeral. The burial was at Seaside Memorial, a sprawling cemetery on a hill overlooking the Gulf. Thomas's plot was in the old section, under a massive live oak draped with Spanish moss. His first wife, Isabel, was buried 20 feet away. I could see her headstone from where we stood. Elena had insisted on it, and Thomas had agreed. She was Elena's mother, he'd told me once. She deserves to be close. I'd never asked where I would be buried when my time came. I wondered now if Thomas had even considered it. As they lowered the casket, Elena broke. It was the first real emotion I'd seen from her. She sobbed into her hands, shoulders shaking, and Rosa held her while I stood apart, dry-eyed and numb. I couldn't cry. Not because I didn't hurt. God, I hurt in ways I didn't have words for. But because something in me had gone very still and very cold, like I was waiting for something, some other shoe to drop. The reception was back at the mansion. I'd hired caterers, arranged for an open bar, set out photos of Thomas throughout his life. His childhood in Corpus Christi, his college graduation, his wedding to Isabel, Elena as a baby, the boat launch that had started Rivera shipping, and yes, our wedding too. Though I'd tucked those photos in the back where they wouldn't overshadow the earlier chapters of his life. People filled the house, eating and drinking and sharing stories. I moved through them like a sleepwalker, accepting hugs and condolences, hearing the same phrases over and over. He was a great man, such a tragedy. If there's anything we can do. Elena held court in the living room, surrounded by her friends from Austin, glossy, polished women who looked like they'd walked out of a Neiman Marcus catalog. And I overheard her talking about her father's legacy, his vision, how she planned to honor his memory through the company. Our company, I thought bitterly, though I'd never had any part in it. Thomas had kept his business life separate, coming home to me for peace, he said, for normalcy. Now I wondered if he'd just been protecting his real life, the one that mattered, from the temporary arrangement I represented. By 9 o'clock, the guests had thinned to just a few close friends and family. I was in the kitchen, boxing up leftover food, when Marshall Hewitt found me. He was 70, silver-haired, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and he'd been nothing but gentle with me since Thomas died. "Claire," he said softly, "I need to speak with you and Elena. Tomorrow, if possible. There's the matter of the will." I nodded, wiping my hands on a towel. "Of course. Whatever needs to be done. 10 o'clock at my office? I'll call Elena." "That's fine." He hesitated, his hand on my shoulder, and something in his expression made my stomach clench. "Claire, I want you to know, Thomas loved you very much. Please remember that tomorrow, no matter what." That should have been my second warning, but I was too tired, too grief-stunned to read the subtext. I just thanked him and went back to cleaning up the remnants of my husband's funeral. Elena left without saying goodbye. I heard her heels clicking across the marble, heard the front door close, and then the house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of waves breaking against the seawall. I walked through the empty rooms, turning off lights, and tried to imagine what came next. I assumed I'd stay in the mansion. Thomas would have provided for me, surely. Maybe Elena and I would figure out some arrangement. Maybe we'd even finally build a relationship, bonded by our shared loss. I was so fucking naive. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in our bed, my bed now, I supposed, and stared at the ceiling, replaying every conversation Thomas and I had ever had about the future. He'd always been vague about specifics, brushing off my questions about wills and estates with, "You'll be taken care of. Don't worry about it." I'd trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was my husband. He'd promised to love and protect me until death did us part. And he had, I realize now. He'd kept every single one of his promises. I just hadn't understood what protection looked like. Marshall's office was downtown, on the 14th floor of a glass tower that reflected the bay like a mirror. I arrived early, parking in the visitor lot and taking the elevator up alone. The receptionist offered me coffee with that particular brand of sympathy people reserve for widows, and I accepted even though my stomach was too knotted to drink it. Elena arrived exactly on time, wearing a crisp white blouse and black pants, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She acknowledged me with a slight nod and sat 2 chairs away in the waiting area, scrolling through her phone. We didn't speak. We'd never known how to speak to each other, even before Thomas died. I'd tried in the beginning. I'd invited her to lunch, asked about her work, complimented her style, but she'd responded with monosyllables and barely concealed resentment. Eventually, I'd stopped trying. Thomas had noticed but never pushed it. Elena's had a hard time since her mother died. He'd said once, she'll come around. She never did. Marshall's office was elegant in an understated way. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, walls lined with law books, and framed photographs of him with various Texas politicians and business leaders. He greeted us both warmly, offered more coffee, and then settled behind his desk with a thick folder. "First, let me say how sorry I am for your loss," he began, looking between us. "Thomas was one of my oldest friends, and I miss him already." Elena nodded curtly. I managed a whispered thank you. "The will is straightforward," Marshall continued, opening the folder. "Thomas was very clear about his wishes. He updated this document 6 months ago, and I witnessed the signing myself. 6 months ago, March. I tried to remember if anything had been different then. Had Thomas seemed worried? Preoccupied? But March had been normal. We'd celebrated our 7th anniversary with a weekend in Fredericksburg, stayed at a bed and breakfast, visited wineries. He'd seemed happy, content. Marshall put on his reading glasses. "To Elena Marisa Rivera, I leave the primary residence at 42125 Ocean Drive, including all furnishings, artwork, and vehicles. I also leave my shares in Rivera Shipping and Transportation, my investment portfolio with Morgan Stanley, and the contents of my checking and savings accounts at First National Bank, with the exception of the account ending in 7742. Additionally, Elena will inherit the boat, the property in Port Aransas, and all personal effects including my father's watch and my mother's jewelry." Elena's face remained impassive, but I saw her shoulders relax slightly. She'd been expecting this, probably hoping for it. Marshall paused, glanced at me, and continued. "To Claire Elizabeth Rivera, I leave the property known as the Fisherman's Cabin, located at 1847 Dock Road, Dock 19, including all structures, contents, and mineral rights associated with that parcel. I also leave the account ending in 7742 at First National Bank, which currently holds $47,000. The words hit me like a physical blow. A cabin, $47,000. That was it. 7 years of marriage, and I got a cabin I'd never heard of and what amounted to a year's salary from my old teaching job. The room tilted slightly. I gripped the arms of my chair, forcing myself to breathe. "That's it?" I heard myself say, my voice thin and strange. Marshall's expression was pained. "That's what the will stipulates, yes. But the mansion, we lived there together. It was our home. It was Thomas's property before your marriage," Marshall said gently. "Purchased in 1998 after Isabel's death. Under Texas community property law, it remained his separate property. And the company? I'm his widow. Don't I have—" "The company shares were also acquired before your marriage. I know this is difficult to hear, Claire, but legally, Thomas had every right to distribute his assets as he saw fit." I turned to Elena, desperate, humiliated, and furious all at once. "Did you know? Did he tell you?" She met my eyes with something like satisfaction. "He discussed his estate planning with me, yes. As his daughter, as his heir. I'm your stepmother. You were his wife for 7 years," she interrupted, her voice sharp and clear. "My mother was his wife for 15. She gave him a child. She built that business with him, working 60-hour weeks while pregnant, managing the office while he was on the boats. She earned every single thing in that house. You taught ESL classes and looked pretty on his arm at fundraisers. What exactly did you think you'd earned?" The cruelty of it stole my breath. Marshall cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Elena, that's not appropriate. It's honest." She stood, smoothing her blouse. "Marshall, I'll need the keys to the mansion transferred to my name, and I'll need Claire out within, what's the legal requirement? 30 days? 60, Marshall said quietly. "But Elena, I'd hope you could be more—" 60 days then. That's generous considering. She picked up her purse, looked down at me with something almost like pity, and said, "You should get the address for that cabin from Marshall. I'm meeting with a realtor next week about listing the mansion. I'll give you notice before any showings, but I'd appreciate it if you started packing sooner rather than later." "Elena, please." She walked to the door, paused, and turned back. Her face was cold, composed, and utterly without mercy. "My father took care of you, Claire. He gave you 7 years in a house you could never have afforded on your own. He gave you a lifestyle, experiences, connections. And now he's given you a place to live and enough money to start over. That's more than generous. That cabin is... I don't even know where it is. Then I guess you'll figure it out. Go live among the seagulls and leave me alone." The door closed behind her with a soft click. I sat there, shaking, while Marshall looked at me with genuine sympathy and helplessness. "Claire, I'm so sorry. If Thomas had asked my advice..." "Did he say why?" My voice cracked. "Did he tell you why he'd do this to me?" Marshall was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into the folder and pulled out a smaller envelope. "He left this for you. Instructions for the cabin. I don't know what's in it." He sealed it himself. I took the envelope with numb fingers. My name was written on the front in Thomas's careful handwriting. "The cabin," Marshall continued, "is yours free and clear. No mortgage, no liens. The property taxes are about $1,200 a year, which the account he left you should cover for quite some time. It's not..." He hesitated. "Claire, I'll be honest. It's not a nice property. I drove by it once years ago when Thomas first bought it. It's old, isolated. I don't know why he wanted it, and I don't know why he left it to you. But it's yours." I left his office in a daze. The elevator ride down felt eternal. In my car, I sat in the parking garage and opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note on Thomas's personal stationery. "Claire, I know this doesn't make sense yet. I know you're hurt and confused. I wish I could be there to explain, but since I can't, I need you to trust me one more time. Go to the cabin, look around, underneath. Everything I did out of love. Everything. T. Underneath. What the hell did that mean?" I drove to Dock Road in the middle of the afternoon, following GPS directions into parts of Corpus Christi I'd never seen. The neighborhoods degraded gradually, from downtown's polished storefronts to chain restaurants to strip malls to industrial warehouses to, finally, nothing but cracked asphalt and chain-link fences topped with barbed wire. The air smelled like petroleum and rotting fish. Dock 19 was at the end of a gravel road that dead-ended at the bay. There were other docks too, most of them empty or supporting small boats in various states of decay. The water here was brown, choked with oil slicks and floating debris. In the distance, I could see the port cranes and container ships, the legitimate maritime industry that Thomas had been part of. But here, on this forgotten stretch of waterfront, everything looked abandoned and toxic. The cabin sat at the end of Dock 19 like something out of a horror movie. It was small, so small, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, with weathered gray wood siding and a rusted metal roof. The windows were filthy, the door hung crooked, and the whole structure leaned slightly to the left, as if it had given up on staying upright. A broken gutter dangled from one corner. The dock beneath it was missing several planks. This was what my husband had left me, this rotting shack in a neighborhood that looked like the set of a crime drama. I sat in my car and cried. Deep, ugly sobs that came from somewhere primal, somewhere I'd been holding everything since Thomas collapsed. I cried for him, for our marriage, for the home I'd lost, for the daughter-in-law who hated me, for my own stupidity in believing I'd mattered as much as I thought I had. When I finally stopped, my face was swollen and my throat was raw. The sun was starting to set, turning the polluted water the color of fire. Seagulls circled overhead, their cries harsh and mocking. "Go live among the seagulls," Elena had said. "Fuck you," I whispered to no one, to everyone, and I got out of the car. The key Marshall had given me stuck in the lock, rusted and stubborn, but I forced it. The door opened with a groan that echoed across the empty dock. Inside, the cabin was worse than I'd imagined. One room, that was it. A kitchenette along one wall, hot plate, rust-stained sink, a mini fridge that hummed ominously, a bed frame with no mattress. A tiny bathroom with a toilet, sink, and a shower stall covered in black mold. The floor was wooden planks, warped and stained, and I could see daylight through gaps in the walls. Everything smelled like brine and decay and something else, something organic and foul that made my stomach turn. This was my inheritance. This was what 7 years of love had earned me. I sank onto the floor, my back against the wall, and stared at the ceiling. Water stains bloomed across it like dark flowers. A spiderweb stretched across one corner, heavy with dust. Underneath, Thomas's note echoed in my mind. Look around. Underneath. I didn't want to look. I wanted to drive back to Marshall's office, sign whatever papers would absolve me of this nightmare, take my $47,000, and start over somewhere far from Corpus Christi, far from Elena, far from the ghost of the man I'd thought I'd known. But something made me stand up. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was fury. Maybe it was the last shred of love I still carried for Thomas Rivera. I started looking. The kitchenette revealed nothing. Empty drawers, a cabinet with a dead roach. The bathroom was equally empty. I checked behind the hot plate under the sink. Nothing. Then I noticed the floorboards near the bed frame. They didn't quite match the others. They were slightly newer, less warped, and the gaps between them were different. I knelt down, running my fingers along the edges, and felt them give slightly under pressure. My heart started pounding. I pried at the boards with my keys, scraping away years of dirt and salt residue. They came up easier than they should have, like they'd been designed to. Beneath them was a hollow space, and inside that space was a metal lockbox. I pulled it out with shaking hands. It was heavy, maybe 2 feet long and a foot wide, covered in a thin layer of rust. There was no lock, just a simple latch that opened with a click. Inside was a letter, a stack of photographs bound with a rubber band, a property deed, and a small leather journal with Thomas's initials embossed on the cover. I took the letter out first. It was 3 pages, front and back, written in Thomas's careful handwriting. My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I can only hope you'll forgive me for what I'm about to tell you. Everything I did to protect you. Everything. I met you 7 years ago at the Literacy Center, and I fell in love with you within an hour. You were teaching a room full of dock workers how to read safety manuals, and you had this way of making them feel smart instead of ashamed. You saw their dignity when the rest of the world saw their limitations. I went home that night and told Rosa I'd met the woman I was going to marry. But I lied to you, Claire. Not about loving you. That was real, the most real thing in my life, but about why I married you when I did. 3 weeks before I asked you out, I was diagnosed with cardiomyopathy, a genetic condition, the doctor said. My father died of it at 51, my grandfather at 48. The doctor gave me 5 to 10 years, maybe less. He recommended I get my affairs in order. I should have told you, I know that. But I'd already fallen in love, and the idea of telling you I was dying, of asking you to sign up for years of medical decline and widowhood, I couldn't do it. So I kept it to myself. I married you, loved you, gave you 7 years that I hope were happy, even though I knew how they'd end. The mansion, the money, the company, those all belonged to my first life, to Isabel and Elena. It wouldn't have been right to give them to you, not when Elena had been waiting her whole adult life to inherit what her mother built. You have to understand, Claire. Isabel died when Elena was 12. She's been without a mother for 17 years. That house, that company, they're all she has left of Isabel. I couldn't take that from her, but I couldn't leave you with nothing either. The cabin isn't what you think it is. Look at the deed, look at the property lines, and then look at the journal. I love you, Claire, I always will, and I need you to know, Elena doesn't know, about any of this, about what I'm leaving you, about why, about what the cabin really is. She thinks I'm punishing you or rewarding her, or both. Let her think that. For now. Trust me one last time. Yours always, Thomas. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the pages. Cardiomyopathy. He'd been dying. The whole time we were together, he'd been dying, and he'd never told me. Every time I'd asked about the future, about growing old together, he'd been lying. Every time he'd seemed distant or preoccupied, he'd been carrying this secret. I should have been furious. I was furious. But beneath the fury was something else. Grief, but also a terrible dawning hope. The cabin isn't what you think it is. I grabbed the deed with shaking hands and held it up to the fading light from the window. The property description wasn't just for the cabin. It was for the entire dock. Dock 19, all 1,200 linear feet of it, plus the submerged land rights extending 200 feet into the bay, plus the mineral and drilling rights for everything beneath it. And there, in the corner of the deed, stamped in fading red ink, was a notation I almost missed. Subject to easement agreement, 2019 TX Port 457. I didn't know what that meant. I grabbed the journal. The first page was dated March 15, 2025, exactly 6 months before Thomas died. Met with Port Authority today. They're expanding the container terminal. Need access to the industrial channel, which means they need Dock 19. Offered me $2 million for the property. Told them I'd think about it. I'm not selling. Not to them. This is Claire's future. I flipped through the pages, my heart hammering. Entry after entry, negotiations, legal consultations, environmental surveys. Thomas had been playing a long game, letting the Port Authority get desperate, letting them increase their offer while he quietly documented everything, building leverage. The last entry was dated September 23, 2025, 2 days before he died. Port Authority came back with final offer. $8, $7 million for the property, easement rights, and cooperation on the environmental clearance. I told them I'm not the one they'll be negotiating with. I told them to contact my wife after I'm gone. Claire, if you're reading this, that cabin is sitting on the most valuable undeveloped waterfront in Corpus Christi. The Port Authority needs it to complete their expansion. They've been trying to buy it for 3 years. I've been stalling, waiting for the price to go up. The cabin is worthless. The land is worth millions. You have leverage. Use it. Make them pay. And then build yourself a life that doesn't depend on anyone else's inheritance. This is how I protect you. Not with a mansion you'd lose when I died, but with something that's entirely yours. Something Elena can never touch. I love you. I'm sorry I lied. I'm sorry I left. T. I sat there on the filthy floor of that rotting cabin, surrounded by spiders and mold and the smell of dead fish, and I started laughing. Deep, gasping laughs that turned into sobs, and then back into laughs. My husband, the dying man who'd loved me enough to lie to me for 7 years, had just made me a millionaire. And his daughter, the woman who'd told me to go live among the seagulls, had no fucking idea. Outside, the sun finished setting, and the seagulls settled onto the dock rails, their white feathers glowing in the dusk. I looked at them through the grimy window, and for the first time since Thomas died, I smiled. "Hello, neighbors," I whispered. I had 60 days to move out of the mansion. I had $7 million waiting for me if I played this right. And I had a story to tell Elena, when the time was right, about what her father had really thought of her, and me, and the choices we make when we love someone more than they'll ever understand. But first, I needed to make a phone call to the Port Authority. And then eventually, I'd need to figure out how to forgive a dead man for the most devastating act of love I'd ever experienced. I spent that first night in my Honda Civic in the parking lot of a Super 8 motel off Highway 181, too wired to sleep, too stunned to drive back to the mansion. The journal sat on my lap, and I read it cover to cover 3 times by the dome light, trying to understand the man I'd married, the man who'd kept so many secrets, the man who'd somehow loved me enough to plan for my future while dying in silence. Thomas had bought the cabin and its property in 2019, 6 months before he met me. According to the journal entries, he'd been approached by a commercial developer who'd wanted the dock for a seafood processing plant. Thomas had declined, but the inquiry had made him curious. He'd researched the property, discovered it was at the center of planned port expansion, and purchased it for $60,000 from an estate sale. The old fisherman who'd owned it had died without heirs, and no one else had understood what the property would become. Thomas had understood. He'd been poor once, had worked the docks himself as a teenager, and he knew how the shipping industry moved, how ports grew, how real estate that looked worthless could become invaluable if you were patient enough. So he'd bought it and waited. And then he'd met me, and been diagnosed, and realized he had a way to give me something that would outlast him, something Elena couldn't claim, something that was mine alone. The last pages of the journal were the hardest to read. They were dated from August and September, written in increasingly shaky handwriting as his condition worsened. August 12th. Doctor says the medication isn't working anymore. 6 months, maybe less. Claire doesn't know. I watch her in the kitchen, humming while she cooks, and I want to tell her everything. But what would that accomplish? She'd spend our last months watching me die instead of living. I can't do that to her. August 29th. Port Authority called again. Up to $7. $8 million now. They're desperate. Environmental study shows the channel expansion is critical for the new trade routes from the Panama Canal. Without access to Dock 19, they'll have to reroute everything through Houston, which will cost them hundreds of millions. I told them I needed more time. The longer I wait, the more Claire gets. September 10th. Met with Marshall today to finalize the will. He thinks I'm insane. He said giving Claire the cabin without explanation will hurt her, that she'll feel abandoned. I tried to explain. She has to discover it herself. If I just hand her millions, Elena will contest it. She'll claim undue influence, diminished capacity, that I wasn't in my right mind. But if Claire finds it on her own, if she's the one who negotiates with the Port Authority, then it's her achievement, her inheritance. No one can take that from her. September 23rd. Chest pain getting worse. Claire wanted to call the doctor yesterday, but I told her it was just indigestion. I'm running out of time. Final meeting with Port Authority tomorrow. $8, $7 million. I'm taking it. Contract specifies payment to the property owner within 90 days of transfer agreement. Claire will have to sign, but she'll be a millionaire by Christmas. That's my gift to her. That's how I say goodbye. I closed the journal and pressed it against my chest, crying in that shitty motel parking lot while trucks roared past on the highway. Thomas had known he was dying. He'd felt the pain, the weakness, and he'd hidden it from me because he'd wanted me to be happy instead of afraid. And in his last weeks, instead of resting, instead of spending time with me, he'd been negotiating a real estate deal that would set me up for life. It was the most devastating love letter I'd ever received. By dawn, I'd made my decision. I would do exactly what Thomas had planned. I would negotiate with the Port Authority, I would sign the deal, and I would take the money. But more than that, I would make sure Elena knew. I would make sure she understood that her father hadn't abandoned me, that he'd loved me enough to give me something worth more than the mansion she was so proud of inheriting. I would make her sit with the knowledge that she'd been cruel to someone her father had cherished, and that her cruelty had been based on an assumption that was completely, devastatingly wrong. I wasn't interested in revenge exactly, but I was very interested in justice. The Port Authority's headquarters was a massive concrete building near the waterfront, all gray efficiency and American flags. I called ahead, told them I was Thomas Rivera's widow and that I needed to discuss property at Dock 19. They gave me an appointment for that same afternoon with a man named Douglas Brennan, Director of Port Development. I went back to the mansion first. It was 9 a.m, and Elena's Mercedes wasn't in the driveway. She was probably at the Rivera shipping offices downtown, already taking over her inheritance. I let myself in, went upstairs to the bedroom, and stood in the closet for a long time, looking at Thomas's suits hanging in their neat row. They still smelled like his cologne, cedar, and citrus. I pressed my face against one and breathed him in until the ache in my chest became unbearable. Then I showered, dressed in the most professional outfit I owned, a navy blazer and gray pants I'd worn to nonprofit fundraisers, and drove downtown to negotiate the biggest deal of my life. Douglas Brennan was in his mid-50s, with the kind of tan that came from weekend sailing and the kind of handshake that communicated both confidence and assessment. His office overlooked the port, and through the window I could see container ships being loaded and unloaded by massive cranes, trucks moving in geometric patterns, the whole orchestrated chaos of international commerce. "Mrs. Rivera," he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his desk. "First, let me offer my condolences. Thomas was, well, he was a hell of a negotiator, sharp as they come." "Thank you," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I appreciate that. I assume you're here about the Dock 19 property." "I am." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with eyes that had probably sized up hundreds of business opponents. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Rivera. We've been trying to acquire that property for 3 years. It's essential for our expansion project. Without it, we're looking at a 2-year delay and cost overruns in the hundreds of millions. Your husband understood that. He also understood leverage. He was good at seeing value where others didn't," I said. "He was. So let me ask you directly, are you prepared to sell?" I thought about Thomas's journal entries, his careful documentation, his patience. I thought about Elena telling me to go live among the seagulls. I thought about 7 years of marriage and a funeral and a cabin that smelled like death. "That depends," I said. "What's your offer?" Brennan smiled slightly, like I'd passed some kind of test. "Your husband and I had reached an agreement at $8, $7 million for the property, all easement rights, and your cooperation with the environmental clearance process. That offer stands. $8.7 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, like monopoly money. But I kept my expression neutral. channeling every ounce of composure I'd learned from watching Thomas negotiate with caterers and contractors over the years. My husband was dying when he agreed to that, I said quietly. He was in pain, distracted, trying to settle his affairs. I'm not dying, Mr. Brennan. I'm thinking very clearly, and I think that property is worth more than $8, $7 million to you. His smile faded. Mrs. Rivera, how much will the delay cost you? If you have to reroute through Houston while you fight this in court, or try to use eminent domain, which won't work because this is commercial expansion, not public necessity, how much will that cost? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You've done your homework. My husband left me notes. I'm sure he did. Brennan stood, walked to the window, hands in his pockets. The expansion is worth about $400 million to the port over the next decade. The delay would cost us roughly $200 million in lost revenue and increased operational expenses. So yes, the property is worth more than $8, $7 million to us. But there's a limit to what the Port Authority Board will approve, and we have taxpayers to answer to. What's the limit? I asked. He turned to look at me, and I saw respect in his eyes that hadn't been there before. $12 million. That's the absolute maximum I can authorize without taking it to a board vote, which would take months and attract media attention neither of us wants. Why wouldn't I want media attention? Because right now, this is a private transaction between you and the Port Authority. You sell, you walk away with your money, and nobody asks questions about how a woman who taught ESL classes suddenly became a millionaire. You start making noise, and people get curious. They start looking at your husband's business dealings, his tax returns, your marriage. You want that scrutiny? It was a threat, but a gentle one. And he was right. I didn't want scrutiny. I wanted money and closure and a future that didn't involve defending my marriage to strangers. $11 million, I said. Cash payment within 60 days. And you put in writing that this deal was negotiated in good faith, that I received independent legal counsel. I hadn't yet, but I would. And that Thomas Rivera's original agreement was superseded by my negotiation. Why does that matter? Because I want it clear that I did this, not him. I want it on record that I'm not just signing his deal. I'm making my own. Brennan studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. 11 million, 60 days. I'll have the contracts drawn up by Friday. We shook hands, and I walked out of that office with my heart pounding so hard I thought I might faint. In the elevator, I leaned against the wall and let myself shake. $11 million. My teaching salary had been $43,000 a year. This was insane. This was Thomas reaching from beyond the grave and rewriting my entire existence. I called Marshall Hewitt from my car. Claire, he answered, his voice warm with concern. How are you holding up? I need you to review a contract for me. The Port Authority wants to buy the cabin property. They're offering $11 million. Silence. Then, I'm sorry. Did you say 11 million? 11 million. Claire, What is this property? Thomas told me it was just an old fishing cabin. It's sitting on the most valuable undeveloped industrial waterfront in Corpus Christi, I said, and I heard the edge of hysteria in my own voice, the laughter threatening to break through. He's been negotiating with the Port Authority for years. He left me documentation, Marshall. He planned this whole thing. Another long silence. Then Marshall said, very carefully, Did Thomas tell you about this before he died? No. I found out yesterday. He left me a letter in the cabin. And a journal. Jesus Christ. Marshall's voice was stunned. That son of a bitch. That brilliant son of a bitch. Can you review the contracts? I need to make sure this is legitimate, that they can't back out, that Elena doesn't have any claim to this property. Marshall interrupted. It's yours, free and clear, left to you in the will. Even if she wanted to contest it, she has no grounds. Thomas's will is ironclad. He paused. Claire, I need to tell you something. Thomas made me promise not to say anything until after you'd been to the cabin. He said you needed to find the information yourself. You knew? I felt the betrayal like a physical thing, hot and sharp. Not the details, not about the Port Authority or the money. He just told me the property was more valuable than it appeared, and that you needed to discover that on your own terms. He said if I told you, it would compromise the inheritance, that Elena might have grounds to challenge it. He made me swear, Claire. I closed my eyes, pressing my forehead against the steering wheel. Everyone was protecting me, even when it hurt. He loved you, Marshall said softly. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but he did. This was his way of making sure you were taken care of. By lying to me for 7 years, by giving you independence, by making sure that when he was gone, you wouldn't be at anyone's mercy. Not Elena's, not mine, not the board of directors at Rivera Shipping. You'd have your own money, your own power, your own choices. Marshall's voice was firm now, the lawyer in him taking over. Send me the contracts when you get them. I'll review every word. And Claire, don't tell anyone about this yet. Not until the deal is signed and the money is in your account. I'm not planning to. But even as I said it, I knew that was a lie. Because there was one person I very much wanted to tell. One person who needed to know exactly what her father had done and why, and what it meant about who he'd really loved. I just had to wait for the right moment. The contracts arrived on Friday, delivered by courier to the mansion. 67 pages of legal language that Marshall and I reviewed together in his office, going through every clause, every contingency. The deal was solid. $11 million paid in 2 installments, the first within 10 days of signing, the second within 60 days. In exchange, I would transfer the deed to the Port Authority and cooperate with all necessary permits and environmental reviews. Sign it, Marshall advised. This is the best deal you're going to get, and frankly, it's more than fair. I signed. My hand was steady. I was becoming a millionaire with the stroke of a pen, and all I could think was that Thomas should have been here to see it, that he'd orchestrated this entire thing, and would never know if it worked. Except he had known. He'd known it would work because he'd built in every protection, every safeguard. He'd trusted the Port Authority's desperation and my ability to negotiate. He'd trusted me, even when I hadn't trusted myself. The first payment hit my account 8 days later, $5.5 million. I logged into my online banking from my laptop in the mansion's study, Elena's mansion now, though she hadn't moved in yet, and stared at the number until it started to look like a glitch, like the bank had made some catastrophic error. But it was real. The money was real. I was a millionaire. And Elena had no idea. She'd been busy with the company, spending 12-hour days at the Rivera shipping offices, meeting with managers and accountants and lawyers, learning the business her father had built. She'd called me twice to arrange times for realtor showings, both conversations brief and cold. We were circling each other like wounded animals, neither willing to engage, both waiting for something neither of us could name. I started packing, not because Elena demanded it, but because I couldn't stay in that house anymore. Every room reminded me of Thomas, and every reminder was now colored by the knowledge that he'd been dying while we'd lived there together. I packed his clothes to donate, his books to give to the library, his personal effects to box up for Elena. I packed my own things, which weren't much, really. I'd come to that mansion with 2 suitcases and a carload of books, and 7 years later, I didn't have much more. The life I'd built there had been borrowed, temporary, and now it was over. I hired movers. I rented a storage unit. I found a short-term rental apartment near the university, a 1-bedroom with decent light and a view of a parking lot. It was about as far from the Bayfront mansion as you could get while staying in Corpus Christi, and that felt right somehow. I was starting over. I needed a space that was mine, even if it was temporary. I didn't tell Elena about the Port Authority deal. I didn't tell anyone except Marshall, who'd advised me to keep it quiet until the second payment cleared. But I started planning. I researched financial advisors, interviewed 3 different wealth management firms, opened investment accounts. I looked at real estate, not in Corpus Christi, but in other cities, Austin, San Antonio, maybe even out of state. I could go anywhere now. I could do anything. The freedom was terrifying. I was loading boxes into my car on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Thomas's funeral, when Elena's Mercedes pulled into the driveway. She got out wearing a business suit, her hair pulled back, looking every inch the corporate executive she was becoming. She watched me carry a box of kitchen items to my trunk, her expression unreadable. "You're leaving early," she said. "You have another month." "I don't need another month," I replied, setting the box down carefully. "I've found a place. I'll be out by this weekend." Something flickered across her face. Not quite relief, but close. That's probably for the best. Probably. We stood there in the driveway of the house we'd both lived in, the house that would never be mine again, and for a moment I almost told her. Almost said, "Your father left me $11 million. He loved me enough to plan for my future while he was dying. He gave me more than you'll ever understand." But I didn't. Because the timing wasn't right yet. and because some part of me wanted her to feel the full weight of her cruelty before she learned the truth. "I've been going through Dad's office," Elena said abruptly. "There are some personal items I thought you might want. Photos, letters." "From when?" I asked carefully. "From your marriage. There's a whole file of them. Cards you gave him, pictures from trips." She paused, and for the first time since Thomas died, she looked uncertain. He kept everything. Every anniversary card, every birthday note. They're all there, organized by date. The information hit me like a punch. He'd kept everything. He'd documented our life together as carefully as he'd documented the Port Authority negotiations. "Thank you," I managed. "I'd like to have those." Elena nodded, then hesitated. "Claire, I need to ask you something." "Okay. Did he seem different to you in the last few months? Did he seem worried? Distracted?" My heart started pounding. She was looking for something, some answer that would make sense of her father's death, of the will, of everything that had happened. And I could give her that answer. I could tell her about the cardiomyopathy, about the journal, about how Thomas had known he was dying and had spent his last months securing both our futures. But I didn't. "He seemed tired sometimes," I said instead. "But he never complained. You know how he was." She nodded slowly. "He never complained. Even when Mom was dying, even when the business was struggling in 2008, he just kept going. Like nothing could touch him. He was strong," I agreed. "Too strong," Elena said quietly. "I used to wish he'd show more emotion. After Mom died, he was just so controlled. Like he'd put his grief in a box and locked it away." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something I'd never seen before in her eyes. Vulnerability. "Do you think he was happy? With you?" The question was so unexpected, so raw, that I almost couldn't answer. But then I thought about Thomas standing on the terrace at dawn, watching the seagulls. I thought about him making me coffee exactly the way I liked it. I thought about him saying, "I love you, Claire," 2 nights before he died, saying it like a promise and a warning and a benediction. "Yes," I said. "I think he was happy." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back furiously. "Good. That's good." She turned and walked back to her car, and I watched her go. This woman who'd hated me for 7 years, who'd told me to go live among the seagulls, who was now trying to reconcile the father she'd known with the father who'd loved me. I felt sorry for her then. Not enough to tell her the truth, not yet, but enough to understand that she was grieving too, in her own complicated way. The second payment from the Port Authority cleared on October 15th, exactly 60 days after I'd signed the contracts. The remaining $5 million appeared in my account like magic, and suddenly I had $11 million plus the $47,000 Thomas had left me in the bank account. I sat in my rental apartment staring at my laptop screen and felt absolutely nothing. The money was too big, too abstract. It didn't feel real. What felt real was the empty apartment around me, the boxes I still hadn't unpacked, the profound loneliness of being a widow at 42 with no family except a stepdaughter who despised me. I called Rosa, Thomas's sister, the only member of his family who'd ever been kind to me. "Claire," she answered, her voice bright with surprise. "How are you, mija? I've been meaning to call, but I didn't want to bother you." "I'm okay," I said, though I wasn't sure that was true. "Rosa, I need to tell you something. About Thomas, about what he left me." I told her everything. The cabin, the journal, the Port Authority deal, the money. I told her about Thomas's diagnosis, about how he'd hidden his illness, about how he'd spent his last months planning for my future. I cried while I talked, and Rosa cried too, and when I was finished, she was quiet for a long time. "That sounds like my brother," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "He always thought he had to carry everything alone. Even when Isabel was dying, he wouldn't let anyone help. He was so stubborn. He should have told me," I said. "Yes, he should have. But Claire, you have to understand. Thomas grew up with nothing. Our father worked on the docks until his heart gave out when Thomas was 16. Our mother cleaned houses until she couldn't stand anymore. We learned early that you take care of yourself because no one else will. Thomas never unlearned that, even when he had money, even when he had people who loved him. He always thought he had to be the protector. I would have protected him too," I whispered. "If he'd let me. I know, mija, I know." We talked for another hour, and by the end I felt lighter somehow, like sharing the secret had made it more bearable. Rosa made me promise to visit her in San Antonio, to let her take me to her church, to not disappear into my grief. I promised, and I meant it. That night, I drafted an email to Elena. I wrote and deleted it 7 times before I finally settled on something that felt right. Elena, I wanted you to know that I'm officially moved out of the mansion. The keys are with Marshall Hewitt. The house is yours now, completely. I also wanted you to know that I've sold the property your father left me, the cabin at Dock 19. The Port Authority needed it for their expansion project. Your father bought that property in 2019 for $60,000. He left me documentation showing that he'd been negotiating with the Port Authority for 3 years, letting the price increase as they became more desperate. He was diagnosed with cardiomyopathy 6 months before he met me, and he knew he was dying. He spent the last months of his life finalizing a deal that would secure my future. I sold the property for $11 million. I'm not telling you this to hurt you or to gloat. I'm telling you because you deserve to know who your father really was. He was a man who took care of the people he loved even when they didn't know they needed it. He gave you the mansion and the company because they represented your mother's legacy, and he knew how much that meant to you. He gave me the cabin because he knew I'd need to be independent, to have my own power, to not be at anyone's mercy after he was gone. He loved us both, Elena. Differently, but completely. And I think he hoped that eventually we'd understand that. I'm not asking for a relationship. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking you to think about what your father wanted for both of us, and whether the way we've treated each other honors his memory. Claire. I read it 20 times before I sent it. My finger hovered over the send button for 5 full minutes, and then I clicked it, and the email disappeared into the void, and there was no taking it back. Elena didn't respond that night. She didn't respond the next day or the day after that. A week passed, then 2. I started to think she'd simply ignored it, that she'd decided I wasn't worth her time or energy. I moved forward with my life, met with financial advisors, set up investment accounts, started looking at graduate programs and education policy at UT Austin. I was 42. I had money now. I could do whatever I wanted with the rest of my life. And then, 3 weeks after I sent the email, Elena showed up at my apartment. She looked terrible. Her eyes were red and swollen, her hair pulled back in a messy bun instead of her usual perfect style, and she was wearing jeans and a t-shirt instead of one of her designer outfits. She stood in my doorway looking young and lost, and nothing like the confident woman who'd told me to go live among the seagulls. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I stepped aside, and she walked into my small apartment, looking around at my unpacked boxes and secondhand furniture like she was seeing an alien landscape. "I've been reading Dad's journal," she said abruptly. "The one he kept about the Port Authority deal. Marshall gave it to me. He said you wanted me to have it. I hadn't told Marshall to do that, but I was glad he had. What did you think?" I asked carefully. Elena's face crumpled. "I think I was a bitch to you. I think I spent 7 years hating you for something that wasn't your fault. I think my father tried to make sure we were both taken care of, and I threw it back in his face by being cruel to the woman he loved." She sat down on my cheap IKEA couch and put her face in her hands. I found other things too, in his office. Letters he wrote to me after Mom died. Letters he never sent. He wrote about how guilty he felt that he couldn't be the father I needed, that he'd shut down emotionally because if he let himself feel how much losing Mom hurt, he wouldn't be able to function. He wrote about how he met you and felt like maybe he could try again, could be happy again, but he was terrified I'd hate him for it. "Elena, he was right to be terrified," she interrupted, looking up at me with tears streaming down her face, "because I did hate him for it. I hated him for finding you, for being happy, for moving on when I couldn't. And I took it out on you because it was easier than being angry at him." I sat down next to her, not quite touching, leaving space between us. "Your father was dying the whole time I knew him. He was in pain and scared, and he never told me because he didn't want me to suffer. Do you know how that feels? To realize the person you loved most was going through hell and you never even noticed?" "I noticed," Elena said quietly. "I saw him getting tired, saw him wincing sometimes like something hurt. But he always said he was fine, and I wanted to believe him, so I did." She looked at me. "Did you really not know about any of it?" "Not until I found the journal in the cabin." "Jesus." She laughed, but it was bitter. "He was such a control freak. Even dying, he had to orchestrate everything. He wanted to protect us. He wanted to control the narrative," Elena corrected, but there was no heat in it. "That's what he did. At the company, in his personal life, He always needed to be the one managing the story. She paused. But the story he was managing was that we'd both be okay without him. That's what this was all about, wasn't it? Making sure we'd survive. I think so, I agreed. We sat there in silence for a while. Two women who'd loved the same man in different ways, who'd both been shaped by his secrets and his sacrifices. Finally, Elena said, "I'm sorry for what I said at Marshall's office, for telling you to go live among the seagulls, for making you feel like you didn't matter." "I'm sorry too," I said, "for not trying harder with you, for giving up." "You shouldn't have had to try so hard," Elena said. "I should have met you halfway." She stood to leave, and I walked her to the door. Before she left, she turned back and said, "What are you going to do now? With the money?" I thought about it. "I don't know yet. Maybe go back to school, maybe travel, maybe just figure out who I am when I'm not someone's wife." Elena nodded. "Dad would be proud of you for negotiating that deal, for standing up for yourself. He always said you were stronger than you thought you were." He said that? All the time. To Rosa, to Marshall, to me. She smiled slightly. I didn't believe him. I thought he was just being sentimental, but he was right. After she left, I stood at my window and watched her drive away. This woman who'd hated me and was now trying to forgive me, or forgive herself, or both. And I thought about Thomas, about all the ways he'd tried to protect us, to provide for us, to make sure his death wouldn't destroy us. He'd succeeded. But the cost of that success was that neither of us had gotten to say goodbye to the real him, the scared, dying man beneath the controlled exterior. We'd both been left with ghosts and secrets and money that could never replace what we'd actually lost. I picked up my phone and called the financial advisor I'd been working with. "I want to set up a scholarship fund," I said, "for kids from working-class families in Corpus Christi who want to study business or maritime trades, something in Thomas Rivera's name. If I was going to be a millionaire, I was going to do it in a way that honored the man who'd made it possible. The man who'd grown up poor and never forgot it. The man who'd loved me enough to lie to me for 7 years so I wouldn't spend them watching him die. That was the least I could do. That was how I'd say goodbye." The scholarship fund became my obsession. I threw myself into it with the kind of fervor people reserve for religion or revenge, spending 12-hour days researching nonprofit structures, interviewing education consultants, drafting mission statements. Marshall helped me navigate the legal framework, setting up the Thomas Rivera Memorial Scholarship Foundation as a 501c3 with an initial endowment of $2 million. The remaining $9 million I split between conservative investments, a small house I bought in the King's Crossing neighborhood, nothing like the Bayfront mansion, just a modest 3-bedroom with a garden I could tend myself, and liquid savings for whatever came next. The scholarship would provide full tuition, books, and living expenses for 10 students per year from Corpus Christi's working-class neighborhoods. The north side where Thomas had grown up, the industrial areas near the port, the trailer parks on the outskirts where families worked 2 jobs and still couldn't make rent. Students studying business, maritime trades, logistics, anything that would help them build the kind of empire Thomas had built from nothing. I wanted his legacy to be more than money. I wanted it to be opportunity. Elena surprised me by offering to sit on the board. We met for coffee at a cafe downtown, neutral territory, both of us nervous and overly polite, like diplomats negotiating a ceasefire. She wore jeans again, her hair down, and she looked more like the 29-year-old she was instead of the hardened executive she'd been performing. "I've been thinking about what Dad would want," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee with precise, anxious movements. "And I think he'd want me to be part of this, to help carry it forward." "I'd like that," I said carefully. "I've also been thinking about the company." She looked up at me, and I saw uncertainty in her expression, vulnerability that reminded me she was still young, still figuring out how to fill her father's enormous shoes. Dad built Rivera Shipping to give people like him opportunities. But it's become, corporate, soulless. The managers are focused on margins and efficiency, and I get that. That's business. But somewhere along the way, we stopped caring about the workers, about the families who depend on those jobs. What are you going to do about it? I don't know yet, but I'm thinking about it. She paused. "Claire, can I ask you something? About Dad? About your marriage?" My chest tightened. "Okay. Were you happy? Really happy? Not just comfortable or content, but actually happy?" I thought about Thomas making me coffee every morning, about his hand finding mine under the dinner table, about the way he'd kiss my forehead when he thought I was sleeping. I thought about the lies, too, the secrets, the way he'd carried his death sentence alone because he couldn't bear to share the weight. Yes, I said. I was happy. It wasn't perfect. Nothing is. But I was happy. I'm glad. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. I'm glad he had that at the end. After Mom died, he was so broken. I was 12, and I remember thinking he'd never smile again. Then years went by, and he did smile sometimes, but it was like he was doing it for me, like he was performing being okay. But with you, I saw him laugh. Really laugh. And I hated you for it because I thought you were replacing Mom. I wasn't trying to replace anyone, I said softly. I know that now. But I was 18 when you guys got married, and I'd spent 6 years being angry at the world for taking my mother, and you were just there. An easy target. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just want you to understand why I was such a bitch. You were grieving, I said. We both were, in different ways. We talked for 2 hours, unpacking 7 years of resentment and misunderstanding. And when we finally left the cafe, I felt lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't know I had. Elena hugged me before she got in her car. A quick, awkward hug that lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it was enough. It was a start. Over the next 3 months, I built a life that was entirely mine. I enrolled in a graduate program in education policy at Texas A&M Corpus Christi, taking evening classes while spending my days developing the scholarship foundation. I hired a program director, a sharp woman named Carmen Rodriguez who'd grown up in the same neighborhood as Thomas and understood viscerally what we were trying to accomplish. I joined a book club at the library, started taking yoga classes at the community center, adopted a rescue dog, a scraggly terrier mix named Hank, who'd been found wandering near the port and had one ear that stuck straight up while the other flopped down. I dated, briefly and disastrously. A history professor who talked about his ex-wife for 3 hours straight, a Port Authority engineer who spent our entire dinner checking his phone, a widower I met at the grief support group I'd started attending, who kissed me in his car and then immediately started crying because I wasn't his dead wife. I gave up after that, decided I wasn't ready, maybe wouldn't ever be ready. Thomas had been it for me, the great love, the one that mattered, and whatever came next would always be a footnote, but I was okay with that. I was learning to be alone without being lonely, to build a life that was full even if it was solitary. The first scholarship recipients were selected in March, 8 months after Thomas died. We held a ceremony at the community center in the North Side, and all 10 students came with their families, parents who worked as housekeepers and dock workers and restaurant cooks, siblings who watched with wide eyes, grandparents who cried when their grandchildren's names were called. Carmen gave a speech about opportunity and hard work, and Elena spoke about her father's belief that everyone deserved a chance to build something meaningful. I stood at the back of the room and watched, and I felt Thomas there with me. Not literally. I didn't believe in ghosts, but in the way those kids' faces lit up when they understood what this scholarship meant, in the way their parents hugged them and took pictures, in the way the whole room felt charged with possibility. This was what Thomas had wanted. This was how he'd wanted to be remembered. After the ceremony, a woman approached me. She was in her 50s, wearing a cleaning company uniform, and she had Thomas's eyes, dark and warm and impossibly kind. Mrs. Rivera? She said tentatively. I'm Maria Santos. My son, Miguel, he just got the scholarship. I remember, I said, smiling. He wants to study maritime logistics. Yes, he's so smart, Mrs. Rivera. He graduated top of his class, but we can't afford college. I work 2 jobs, and his father, he left when Miguel was 3. I thought my boy would end up at the port, loading containers like everyone else from our neighborhood. Nothing wrong with that, but Miguel, he wants more. He wants to be the one running things, making decisions. She grabbed my hands, squeezing tight. You gave him that chance. You and Mr. Rivera. I don't have words to thank you. I squeezed back, my throat tight with emotion. Your son earned this. He worked hard. He deserves it. Mr. Rivera, he used to come to our neighborhood sometimes. Did you know that? Years ago, before he was famous, before the big house and the company, he'd come and talk to kids at the community center, tell them they could be anything if they worked hard enough. My son, he met Mr. Rivera when he was 8 years old. Mr. Rivera gave him a book about ships, about how global trade works. Miguel still has that book. He showed it to me when he found out about the scholarship, and he said, "This is why I want to study logistics, Mama. Because Mr. Rivera showed me what's possible." I hadn't known that. Thomas had never mentioned it, but then he'd never mentioned a lot of things. He'd just gone out and done them quietly, without fanfare, without needing recognition. "Thank you for telling me," I managed. "I think Thomas would be really proud of Miguel." That night, I drove to the cabin. I hadn't been back since the day I discovered the lockbox, and I'd been avoiding it because I wasn't sure what I'd feel. But now, with the scholarship ceremony fresh in my mind, with Maria Santos's gratitude still warming my chest, I needed to see it. I needed to understand what Thomas had been thinking when he'd bought this place, when he'd planned this whole elaborate scheme. The dock looked the same, weathered, sagging, surrounded by the industrial detritus of the port. But the cabin itself had been demolished as part of the Port Authority deal, and in its place was just an empty concrete pad and pilings. The water lapped against the dock supports, and seagulls circled overhead, their cries sharp in the twilight. I stood there for a long time, watching the sunset over the bay, and I thought about Thomas standing in this exact spot, imagining my future. He'd known he was dying. He'd known I'd be alone. And instead of leaving me dependent on Elena's goodwill or trapped in memories of our marriage, he'd given me this ugly, forgotten piece of waterfront that had contained a fortune and a future. "I'm angry at you," I said out loud, speaking to the ghost of my husband, "for lying to me, for dying, for not trusting me enough to share the truth." The seagulls screamed in response, and I laughed. "But I'm also grateful. I hope you know that. I'm grateful for every single day we had, even if they were built on secrets. I'm grateful that you loved me enough to plan for this, to give me a way forward. And I'm grateful that you were stubborn enough to turn this piece of shit dock into something that mattered." I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the empty space where the cabin had been, the water beyond it, the seagulls settling onto the pilings for the night. Then I sent it to Elena with a message. Among the seagulls. "Miss him." She responded 5 minutes later. "Me too. Coffee tomorrow?" "Yes." I drove home as the stars came out, and Hank greeted me at the door with his usual enthusiastic chaos. And I made myself dinner in my modest kitchen while listening to a podcast about education reform. It was a small life, a quiet life, but it was mine, and that was enough. But the past wasn't finished with me yet. In April, Marshall called and asked me to come to his office. His voice on the phone was strange, careful, almost nervous. And when I arrived, I found him sitting with a woman I'd never met. She was in her 60s, elegant in a pale blue suit, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob and eyes that assessed me with clinical precision. "Claire, this is Diane Castellano," Marshall said. "She's a private investigator from Houston. She's been looking into some of Thomas's business dealings." My stomach dropped. "What kind of dealings?" Diane spoke, her voice crisp and professional. "Mrs. Rivera, I was hired by a law firm representing a group of former Rivera shipping employees. They're alleging that your husband engaged in wage theft and labor violations over a 15-year period. They're preparing a class action lawsuit against the company." The words hit me like a physical blow. "That's not... Thomas wouldn't..." "I've reviewed the evidence," Diane continued, pulling out a folder thick with documents. "And I'm afraid there's substantial documentation supporting their claims. Systematically unpaid overtime, misclassification of workers as independent contractors, safety violations that led to injuries. We're talking about millions of dollars in stolen wages affecting hundreds of workers." "No," I said, shaking my head. "You don't understand. Thomas grew up poor. He worked the docks himself. He would never..." "Mrs. Rivera, I understand this is difficult." Diane's voice softened slightly. "But the evidence is clear. The company your husband built was profitable in part because it exploited the very workers he claimed to care about." I looked at Marshall, desperate for him to contradict her, to tell me this was some mistake or a misunderstanding. But his face was grave, and he said quietly, "I've seen the documents, Claire. I wish I could say they were falsified, but they're not. Thomas cut corners. He pressured managers to minimize labor costs. And when workers complained, they were quietly let go. But the scholarship," I said weakly, "the foundation, he cared about those kids." "He did care," Marshall agreed. "That's what makes this so complicated. Thomas was a man of contradictions. He genuinely believed in giving people opportunities, but he also believed that success required ruthlessness. He compartmentalized. The good he did with the scholarship, the donations to community centers, the mentoring, that was all real. but so was this. Diane slid the folder across the desk to me. The lawsuit will be filed against Rivera Shipping, not against you personally. But I wanted to inform you because the media will likely dig into your husband's estate, including the Scholarship Foundation. There will be questions about whether the foundation is an attempt to whitewash his legacy. I opened the folder with numb fingers. Inside were payroll records, internal memos, testimony from workers who'd been injured on the job and then fired when they filed for workers' comp. One memo, dated 2018, was in Thomas's handwriting. We need to cut $400K in labor costs this quarter. Look at overtime hours and find efficiencies. No excuses. Efficiencies. That's what he'd called it. While families struggled to pay rent, while men worked 12-hour days without overtime pay, Thomas had called it efficiencies. What happens now? I asked, my voice hollow. The lawsuit moves forward, Diane said. The company will likely settle. The evidence is too strong for them to win at trial. The workers will get compensation, though not nearly as much as they're owed. And your husband's reputation will be complicated. Ruined, I said. His reputation will be ruined. Yes, probably. Diane's expression was sympathetic but firm. I'm sorry, Mrs. Rivera. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. After she left, I sat in Marshall's office and stared at the folder. Marshall poured me a glass of water, which I didn't drink, and waited. Did you know? I finally asked. I suspected, he admitted. I'd heard rumors over the years. Workers complaining, lawyers sniffing around. But Thomas was my friend, and I didn't want to look too closely. I told myself he was just being a tough businessman, that everyone in the shipping industry operated that way. I was wrong. He lied about everything, I said, and I heard the bitterness in my own voice. Our whole marriage, he was lying. About dying, about the cabin, about who he really was. He loved you, Marshall said. That wasn't a lie. How can you say that? How can you look at this? I gestured at the folder. And tell me he loved me. He stole from workers. He exploited people. And he let me believe he was a good man, a man worth grieving for. He was both, Marshall said quietly. Good and bad. Generous and cruel. That's what makes this so hard, Claire. People aren't simple. Thomas saved lives with his generosity and destroyed them with his greed. He built you a future and built it on the backs of people he'd betrayed. Both things are true. I stood up, grabbed the folder, and walked out. I couldn't breathe in that office, couldn't think. I drove to the university and sat in my car in the parking lot, reading through every document, every piece of evidence that Diane had compiled. There was a statement from a man named Roberto Guzman, who'd worked for Rivera Shipping for 12 years. He'd been injured when a forklift malfunctioned. A malfunction caused by deferred maintenance, another cost-cutting measure. He'd filed for workers' comp, and 2 weeks later he was fired for performance issues. His wife had written a letter to Thomas begging for his job back, explaining that they had 4 children and no savings. Thomas never responded. There was a spreadsheet showing how the company had systematically classified full-time workers as contractors to avoid paying benefits. Hundreds of men who'd worked 40, 50, 60 hours a week for years, never getting health insurance, never getting retirement contributions, barely making minimum wage when you calculated their actual hourly rate. There was an internal email chain where managers discussed how to discourage workers from reporting safety violations. One manager suggested making an example of someone, and Thomas had responded, "Do what you need to do. Just keep it quiet." I read until my eyes burned and my hands shook, and then I drove to Elena's house. She'd moved into a townhouse in Southside, not the mansion. She'd decided to sell it. Too many memories, too much space for one person. She answered the door in yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt, her hair wet from a shower, and her expression shifted to concern when she saw my face. "Claire, what's wrong?" I thrust the folder at her. "Read this." She took it, confused, and I pushed past her into the townhouse. It was sparsely furnished, boxes still stacked in the corner from her move. I sat on her couch and waited while she read, watching her face change from confusion to shock to something that looked like devastation. When she finished, she set the folder down carefully and sat next to me. "How long have you known?" 3 hours. Marshall called me this afternoon. "Is it true? All of it?" The investigator says yes. She has documentation, testimony, everything. Elena was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands. Then she said, "I knew something was off. At the company. The managers, they'd talk about Dad like he was this brilliant strategist, but there was always this edge to it. like they were afraid of disappointing him. And sometimes workers would try to talk to me about problems, and the managers would shut them down fast, tell them to go through proper channels. I thought it was just normal corporate hierarchy. Did you ever look into it? I asked. No. Her voice was small. I didn't want to. I wanted to believe Dad was exactly who he pretended to be. The self-made man, the success story, the guy who lifted people up. I wanted the fairy tale. Me too. We sat there in silence. Two women who'd loved the same man, and were now being forced to reconcile the person we'd loved with the person he'd actually been. It felt like grieving him all over again, but worse somehow. Before, I'd been mourning the loss of him. Now I was mourning the illusion of him. What are we going to do? Elena finally asked. I don't know. The Scholarship Foundation? Do we keep it running? Or is it just a way of cleaning dirty money? I thought about Miguel Santos and his mother, about the 10 students who'd been given a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. I thought about Thomas's memo about cutting labor costs, and I thought about how he'd used the money he'd stolen from workers to fund opportunities for their children. It was grotesque. It was circular. It was impossible to untangle. I think we keep it running, I said slowly. But we change it. We make it bigger. We use the company's money, your money now, to create a compensation fund for the workers who were exploited. We make sure the lawsuit settlement is fair. And then we expand the scholarship to include the children of every worker who was harmed by Rivera Shipping. Elena looked at me, her eyes red with unshed tears. That's going to cost millions. You have millions. I know. She swallowed hard. I just thought I was inheriting a legacy I could be proud of. But it's all tainted now, isn't it? Everything Dad built. It's all built on suffering. Not everything, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The company employs 300 people. It supports families. The shipping routes he established bring goods to communities that need them. It's not all bad, but it's not all good either. No, it's not. Elena stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the street. Mom would have known, she said quietly. She worked at the company in the early days before I was born. She handled payroll, benefits, all of that. If Dad was cutting corners, she would have known. She probably even helped him do it. The idea that Isabel, the sainted first wife, had been complicit in Thomas's exploitation was somehow the most devastating revelation of all. It meant this wasn't just one man's moral failure. It was systemic, generational, a rot at the heart of the business they'd built together. What do you want to do? I asked Elena. With the company? With everything? She turned to face me, and I saw determination in her expression, the first real clarity I'd seen since she'd started reading the folder. I want to make it right. I can't undo what Dad did, and I can't bring back the years those workers lost, but I can change how the company operates going forward. I can pay fair wages, provide benefits, create real safety standards. I can turn Rivera Shipping into what Dad always claimed it was, a company that takes care of its people. That's going to hurt profits, I said. I don't care. I have more money than I'll ever need. I'd rather run a company that lets me sleep at night than maximize shareholder value. She paused. Will you help me? Not with the company. I know that's not your thing. But with the foundation, with the compensation fund. I can't do this alone. I thought about saying no. I thought about walking away from the Rivera name, from the complicated legacy of Thomas's money, from the moral quagmire of trying to do good with resources that had been acquired through harm. It would be easier to take my $11 million and disappear, to build a life that had nothing to do with shipping companies or scholarships, or the ghost of a man who'd loved me and lied to me in equal measure. But I thought about Miguel Santos's mother, about her gratitude, about how her son's life had changed because of an opportunity that Thomas's money had provided. And I thought about all the other workers, the ones who'd been hurt, who deserved compensation and acknowledgement and something that resembled justice. Yes, I said, I'll help you. Over the next 6 months, Elena and I worked together to dismantle and rebuild Thomas Rivera's legacy. The class action lawsuit settled for $8, $3 million, distributed among 247 former employees who'd been exploited by the company. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough, but it was something. Elena personally met with as many of the workers as would agree to see her, apologizing for her father's actions, listening to their stories, acknowledging their pain. Some forgave her. Many didn't. She accepted both responses with grace. We expanded the Scholarship Foundation, adding a specific track for children of Rivera Shipping employees, past and present. We increased the annual budget to support 20 students instead of 10, and we added a mentorship component where recipients would be paired with business leaders and given internship opportunities. We funded it with a percentage of the company's profits, ensuring that the people who'd built Rivera Shipping would directly benefit from its success. Elena restructured the company from the ground up. She brought in labor consultants, hired a new HR director, implemented transparent pay scales and comprehensive benefits. She created a worker advisory board that had real power to influence company decisions. Profits dropped by 18% the first year, and several board members quit. But worker satisfaction went up, injuries went down, and for the first time in decades, Rivera Shipping started getting applications from people who actually wanted to work there, not people who were desperate and had no other options. The media coverage was brutal. Investigative journalists wrote exposés about Thomas's business practices. Former employees gave interviews describing the exploitation they'd endured. The Corpus Christi Caller-Times ran a series titled The Real Thomas Rivera, detailing his ruthless cost-cutting and his simultaneous philanthropy, trying to make sense of a man who could mentor children while stealing from their parents. Elena and I did interviews together, carefully scripted by a PR firm but emotionally honest. We talked about the complexity of legacy, about learning that someone you loved had done terrible things, about the responsibility of inheriting wealth that had been acquired unethically. We were praised by some for our honesty, condemned by others for profiting from exploitation even as we claimed to make amends. I learned to live with the contradiction. I learned to accept that Thomas had loved me truly while simultaneously being capable of real cruelty. I learned that people contain multitudes, that we're all walking contradictions, that the same hands that held me tenderly had signed memos that destroyed lives. It didn't make it okay. It just made it real. In October, 1 year after Thomas died, Elena and I held a memorial service. Not the polished funeral we'd had before, with its mariachi band and 300 guests, but something smaller and more honest. We invited the scholarship recipients and their families, the Rivera Shipping workers, the people who'd known Thomas in all his complexity. We held it at the community center in the North Side, the same place where Thomas used to mentor kids. We served food from the taco truck he'd loved, played his favorite music, and set up a table where people could write down their memories of him, the good and the bad. We wanted both. We needed both. I stood at the front of the room and spoke about the man I'd married. I talked about his gentleness with me, his morning coffee ritual, the way he'd watched seagulls and found peace in their chaos. But I also talked about the journal entries I'd found, the memos about cutting costs, the workers who'd been hurt by his decisions. I talked about how it was possible to love someone and still acknowledge their failures, how grief and anger could coexist, how legacy was always more complicated than obituaries suggested. Elena spoke too, about growing up with a father who was simultaneously present and absent, generous and withholding, loving and controlled. She talked about hero worship and disillusionment, about the process of seeing your parents as flawed humans instead of gods. She cried, and so did I, and so did many people in that room. When the speeches were done, we opened the floor. A few people shared fond memories. Thomas helping them learn to drive, Thomas showing up at their kids' quinceañera, Thomas loaning them money when rent was due. But others shared harder truths. Thomas firing them without cause, Thomas ignoring safety complaints, Thomas treating them as disposable. One man, Roberto Guzman, the forklift operator who'd been injured and fired, stood up and said, "Mr. Rivera destroyed my life. I want everyone here to know that. He took my job, my health, my ability to provide for my family. Because of him, my kids went hungry. My wife had to work 3 jobs. I lost my house." He paused, his voice shaking with emotion. "But I'm here today because his daughter made it right. Not completely, nothing can give me back those years, but enough that I can pay my medical bills, enough that my son is going to college on that scholarship. So I'm here to say, Thomas Rivera was a bastard and a thief, but his daughter is not. And maybe that counts for something." The room was silent. Then Elena stood, walked over to Roberto and said, "I'm so sorry for what my father did to you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for giving me a chance to do better." They shook hands and I saw tears on both their faces. And I thought, this is what justice looks like. Imperfect, incomplete, but real. After the memorial, Elena and I drove to Dock 19. The Port Authority had completed their expansion. There were new cranes, new container terminals, ships twice the size of anything that had been there before. But we'd negotiated to keep a small section of the dock intact. a little observation area with benches and a plaque. The plaque read, "In memory of Thomas Rivera, 1972-2025, a man of contradictions, a builder of opportunities and a source of harm. May we learn from both." We sat on the bench and watched the seagulls circle overhead, their cries echoing across the water. The sun was setting, painting the bay in shades of copper and gold, and the air smelled like salt and diesel and possibility. "Do you think he'd be proud of us?" Elena asked. "Or disappointed that we're exposing all his secrets?" I thought about it. "I think he'd be complicated about it, just like everything else." "That sounds right." She leaned her head on my shoulder, and I was surprised by the gesture, by the easy affection that had slowly developed between us over the year. "Claire, can I tell you something?" "Of course." "I'm glad he married you. I hated it at the time, but looking back, you made him happy. You gave him something good in those last years. And you're helping me figure out how to carry this forward. I couldn't do this alone." "You're not alone," I said. And I meant it. Somewhere over the past year, Elena had become something like family. Not a daughter, I'd never be her mother, but a partner in this strange work of dismantling and rebuilding a legacy. We sat there until the sun disappeared completely, until the seagulls settled onto the pilings for the night, until the industrial sounds of the port faded into the gentle lap of water against concrete. And then we stood up, got in our respective cars, and drove back to our respective lives. Lives that had been shaped by Thomas Rivera's love and lies, his generosity and cruelty, his desperate need to control the narrative even after death. I'd spent a year learning to live among the seagulls, and I'd discovered something Thomas had known all along, that the view from the forgotten places is sometimes clearer than the view from the mansion, that value isn't always where you expect to find it, and that the greatest inheritance isn't money or property or legacy, but the ability to face complicated truths and still choose to move forward. 3 months later, I got a letter from Miguel Santos, the scholarship recipient whose mother had thanked me at the ceremony. He was finishing his first semester at Texas A&M, studying maritime logistics, just like he'd dreamed. His letter was formal and carefully written, like he'd drafted it multiple times. "Dear Mrs. Rivera, I wanted to write to thank you again for the scholarship. I know there's been a lot of news about Mr. Rivera and the company, and I know it's complicated. My mom's cousin worked for Rivera Shipping and was part of the lawsuit. He says Mr. Rivera was a bad man who stole from workers. But my mom says Mr. Rivera gave me that book about ships when I was 8, and that changed my life. She says people can be both good and bad, and we have to decide which parts we want to carry forward." I think about that a lot. I think about how the scholarship is funded by money that maybe shouldn't have existed, but it's giving me an opportunity that definitely should exist. I don't know if that makes it okay, but I know I'm not going to waste it. I'm going to graduate and get a good job, and I'm going to make sure other kids like me get chances too. I'm going to be better than Mr. Rivera was. That's how I'm choosing to honor what you and his daughter are doing. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for believing I was worth investing in. Sincerely, Miguel Santos. I read that letter 5 times, and then I folded it carefully and put it in the lockbox where I kept Thomas's journal and the documents from the cabin. Someday, maybe I'd write my own account of this year. Not for publication, but just to process it. To make sense of how a man's death had unraveled so many lives and then, slowly, rewoven them into something new. But not yet. I was still living it. Still figuring out what it meant to inherit not just money, but responsibility. Not just love, but also the obligation to face what that love had enabled. I went to my bookshelf and pulled out the photo album I'd compiled over the past year, pictures from the scholarship ceremony, from the memorial service, from the community events Elena and I had organized. There was a photo of Elena and me standing on Dock 19, both of us squinting into the sun, both of us smiling despite everything. I added Miguel's letter to the album, tucking it carefully between pages, and then I closed it and put it back on the shelf. Outside my window, the sun was setting again, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear seagulls crying their harsh, beautiful song. I thought about Thomas standing on the dock, watching those same birds, planning my future with his dying hands. I thought about the cabin that had held a fortune, about the mansion I'd lost and hadn't really needed, about the million ways people try to love each other and fuck it up and still, somehow, manage to leave something worthwhile behind. "I forgive you," I said out loud, speaking to the ghost of my husband one last time. Not for everything, but for enough. And then I made myself dinner, fed Hank his kibble, and settled in to study for my graduate school midterms. Because life went on, even after devastating revelations and complicated reckonings. It went on, and you went with it, carrying what you could and letting go of what you couldn't, finding meaning in the spaces between betrayal and grace. I was 43 years old. I was a widow and a millionaire and a graduate student and a foundation director. I was learning to live with contradictions, to build a life from the rubble of assumptions, to find value in unexpected places. I was learning to live among the seagulls, and it was enough. When my husband died, he left the mansion to my daughter and me an old fisherman's cabin. On the first day, she screamed, "Go live among the seagulls and leave me alone." And upon opening the cabin, I discovered a secret that changed everything.